مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إنه مبدأ أساسي في السياسة الأميركية. السياسة الخارجية هي الظاهرة للأعيان، وكل السياسات الحقيقية هي محلية، إلا إذا كانت ثم مأساة أو كارثة رهيبة. عندئذ يتوافق كل شيء ويراقب الجميع ما الذي يحصل، كما لو أنهم يشاهدون حادث سيارة على الطريق السريع. حاليا تركز كل السياسات الأمريكية على معرفة ما إذا كان بوسع الديمقراطيين أن يتوحدوا بما فيه الكفاية لتمرير خطة الإنفاق الهائلة التي أعداها الرئيس بايدن، ومعرفة ما إذا كان الجمهوريون يستطيعون البناء على نجاحهم الانتخابي الأخير لاستعادة سيطرتهم خلال العام المقبل على الكونغرس. لكن العالم لن ينتظر، لا البرنامج النووي الإيراني، ولا ضغط الصين على تايوان، ولا الهجمات على الحكومات الديمقراطية في جميع أنحاء العالم. كيف تتعامل إدارة بايدن مع هذه القضية؟ هل هي بصدد تحقيق نجاحات؟ هل هي تتعرض للفشل؟ هل هناك عقيدة بايدن؟ لمناقشة السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية بعد زيارة الرئيس بايدن إلى أوروبا، يسعدني أن ترحب طاولتنا المستديرة بالخبيرين المتميزين دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. America these days is focused inwards, but the world is not waiting for us to sort out our domestic issues. Let's take a look at what's happening around the world that deserves the attention of our leaders. First, I'm very happy to welcome back Dennis Ross and Juan Zarate. Gentlemen, welcome. All right, let's start with Glasgow and climate, a high priority for the Biden administration. President Biden went abroad and did something that presidents don't usually do. He apologized for his predecessor. What did he say and why? And what did the president more broadly accomplish on this European trip? Dennis, let's start with you.
Well, I think the aim of the apology was to explain that because of what the Trump administration had done, the U.S. had not played its role, certainly not fulfilled its responsibilities in terms of dealing with the nature of the climate threat. In many ways, because of our behavior over the last 4 years, we were adding to the problem, not in a sense ameliorating it. And I think he was trying to suggest, look, we're very serious now. When I say build back better, it's going to be build back better on this as well. Look at the infrastructure package we will pass soon, which he was able, fortunately for him, after the fact. And while Glasgow was still going on, he had that passed. He was able to point to the kind of things we would be doing that will seriously address our need to get to net zero in terms of global emissions, in terms of our emissions. So I think he was, first of all, trying to say, we're back in this game, we're serious about it. He would have liked to have arrived with that legislation having already passed, but his whole point was to lend himself some credibility in our efforts by apologizing for what wasn't done by his predecessor. Did he accomplish everything that could be accomplished there? I think there's a bigger question for everybody when it comes to climate change. It's easy to establish, at least in principle, meeting, the net global emissions of zero by 2050, or in the Chinese case, 2060. It almost becomes a slogan unless it's backed by very concrete policies. I think he was certainly trying to show the U.S. is in the leadership on this role. Many, I think, who are watching will say the proof's going to be in the pudding, not just for us, but for everyone else as well.
Juan, when you look at Glasgow, does this look like it has the makings of an effective international gathering that will finally do what needs to be done?
Well, I agree with Dennis. I think the proof is in the pudding. It depends on what actually is done with the commitments. We've seen international meetings, whether you're talking about development, you're talking about aid, you're talking about crises, you're talking about climate change, where countries make commitments but don't follow up, frankly. And this is, frankly, the voice of the activists who've been very concerned that we're marching along with climate change without real sacrifice or real change that would meet the commitments that are being made politically. And so I think we'll have to see. I think the lack of Chinese presence was indicative of a lack of seriousness, frankly, from the Chinese to actually do the hard things like not construct more coal factories and coal emission elements within the Chinese economy. I think there's a real question of seriousness, not just from the U.S., but from key emitters like the Chinese. I do think what President Biden was trying to do was to reassert American leadership writ large. And for him, climate change is the leading indicator of that leadership, which explains then his tone and his methodology. I do think, Rob, there's a danger for American presidents to go abroad and to apologize, not for prior policy, because I think that's understandable. You saw that with President Obama with some of the Bush administration counterterrorism policies, for example. But it's another thing to apologize for your predecessor himself. It injects a bit too much politics, I think, into foreign policy. It also raises the specter that these are policies that can change on a whim. And this is a question that America's allies, as well as its rivals, have with respect to what is the consistency of American foreign policy, whether it's on climate change, key alliances, our fortitude in places like Afghanistan. Those are key questions that arise whenever you inject politics into foreign policy.
Thank you for that one. Actually, I wanted to pick up on your reference to China. As you noted, America's greatest great power competitor was not at Glasgow, China. So let me focus on China for a minute. While this was going on, we did have another in a now long series of incremental rising tensions between China and Taiwan. And President Biden misspoke, as it were, about the U.S. commitment to the island nation. How serious, in your view, how urgent is the Chinese threat to Taiwan? And how do you understand the American commitment, which either does or doesn't exist? It's a bit unclear, the American commitment to Taiwan. I'd be interested in both of your views on that, but start first with you, Juan.
Rob, I think Taiwan has become and will become both a flashpoint and a bellwether for American foreign policy and its relationship with China. There's no question, you've seen with the provocative actions from China and some of the softer elements that China's trying to signal that Taiwan is not only a part of one China, but will ultimately fall within its umbrella. And the moves that we've seen in Hong Kong are a leading indicator as to what comes next potentially with Taiwan. And the Taiwanese know it and sense it. And so there's a sense that not only is there a potential for military action from the Chinese, which is quite possible, the Taiwanese have talked recently of concerns around a blockade, for example, and the ability to break that blockade, but also the softer elements of Chinese influence through financial and economic tools to actually embed themselves and to control further. And of course, is the key element of identity for the Chinese themselves. So Taiwan is really a flashpoint. And it comes at a time when there's a question as to America's commitment to its allies and to its word to defend countries like Taiwan. And to your point, there is confusion about that, not just because of the wording of the president or the messaging from the administration, but because of what happened in Afghanistan and the question of what we do or don't do for our allies. I think it's fair to say the same question arose in the prior administration with what we did with Syria and backing out of parts of Syria and not supporting our Kurdish allies. So there's a fundamental question as to what American alliance means. And if push comes to shove and the Chinese are willing to use force, to exert pressure, if not control over Taiwan, will the U.S. back and defend the Taiwanese? The indicators are that we will, but there's a lot of doubt and question.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to go from one easy foreign policy problem to an even easier one. What the Iranians are doing on everything from regional mischief to incrementally getting closer and closer to a nuclear bomb. In just a moment. Speaking in Glasgow at the Global Climate Summit, Joe Biden apologized for his predecessor's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord and made an impassioned plea for action to save the planet from climate change. In so doing, he could draw on a surprisingly bipartisan tradition of environmentalism among presidents. Indeed, the two most celebrated patrons of the environment from the Oval Office were, ironically, Republicans. The first, most famously, was Teddy Roosevelt, the former Rough Rider and confirmed outdoorsman who used his authority to establish 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game reserves, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments on over 230 million acres of public land. Less famous is perhaps the most notorious president in our history, Richard Nixon, who was responsible for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, the first centralized government agency responsible for safeguarding America's air, water, and other environmental resources. From Roosevelt to Nixon to Biden, an unusual trio of presidents connected to each other by at least this one attribute. Let's talk for a minute about what the Iranians have been up to. Since we last met, Iran and its proxies have attacked U.S. forces in Syria, seized another ship in the Gulf, tried to assassinate the Iraqi prime minister, and at the same time, they agreed to return to the Vienna nuclear talks. Juan, when you look at it, what's Tehran's strategy?
Well, it's the same playbook, Rob, which is to continue to be expansionist and adventurous with its activities, both directly and through proxies, to pressure where they need to, and to do so with force, and to not be either shy about it or to apologize. And in fact, to be quite brazen, especially in light of the assassination attempt of the Iraqi prime minister. So this is the typical Iranian playbook, which is to push the boundaries while then returning to negotiations in hopes for concessions. And unfortunately, Rob, I think they're reading, again, the body language, as we say, the body English of the U.S. negotiators, which seem very eager for a deal on the nuclear side to at least slow what is seemingly continued progress by the Iranians toward a nuclear capacity. And in so doing, they're trying to create more diplomatic running room for themselves and in hopes of a better deal. And the U.S. seems not willing to push back as hard or as consistently as you would imagine. And unfortunately, we have fallen into the same playbook, into the same trap, and we're back at the negotiating table with the Iranians being provocative and seemingly having the upper hand.
All right, so if that is what the Iranian strategy is, Dennis, what is the U.S. strategy and what ought it be?
I wish I could say I understood exactly what the American strategy was, because the absence of a response to many of the steps that the Iranians have taken, meaning absolutely no consequence, makes it hard to reestablish deterrence. I think in principle, what the administration has sought to do from the very beginning is put the Iranian nuclear program back in a box. That's why they wanted to get back into the JCPOA, not because they thought the JCPOA had an answer to everything, because at the same time they said, we understand we need to negotiate a longer and stronger deal. And that will close the loopholes in it. It will extend the sunset provisions that lift the limits on so much that the fundamental parts of the Iranian nuclear program, all the limits lapse in the year 2030. So they understood that. They understood the ballistic missile problem was a problem. They understood destabilization in the region was a problem. And longer and stronger negotiations over longer and stronger agreement were designed to address that. The problem always was, once you got back in the JCPOA, assuming you could, what was the source of your leverage to be able to get more? Now the administration is in a position where I think it's sort of scrambling for plan B, because they're not certain at all that they can get back into the JCPOA. And even if they could, the circumstances are actually different now. The limits that were imposed on the Iranians in some respects will never be reestablished, even if you get back into the JCPOA. What I mean by that is Iran now has acquired a level of knowledge about being able to enrich to very close to weapons grade. They didn't have that before. That doesn't go away. Iran now has installed multiple cascades of advanced centrifuges. Here again, this wasn't supposed to happen until later. The knowledge experiential base that they've developed can't be undone. So Iran right now, even if they went back to the actual numerical limits of the JCPOA, they would be in a dramatically different position than they were supposed to be according to the agreement. So the administration, I think right now, is wrestling with what are its choices. I think it still wants to be able to reverse enrichment to 60%, stopping production of uranium metal, which only has a military, really only a weapons-related purpose. They want to do that, but it doesn't really solve the problem, and the likelihood of being able to produce longer and stronger looks less and less convincing. So the truth is, Rob, I think at this point the administration itself is kind of grasping for what its strategy ought to be.
All right. Well, that's a serious issue. Let's go to, there's one more topic that I wanted to hit before we close today's show. And that is that before we next meet, the administration will host a summit for democracy. Part of the reason is because democracy is having a rough time. It's, in fact, having an especially rough time in the part of the world where our viewers are located. We've had 2 coups in just the Middle East in 2021, in Tunisia and Sudan. And that doesn't say anything about what's happening in the rest of the world. So, Juan, when you look at this issue, what can and should the United States be doing about it, other than gathering other democracies to talk about it?
Rob, you're right. And even Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega, I think, has created yet again an autocratic regime, is another example of democracy in peril. I think 3 things can happen in a summit like this. One is to reassert principles that the U.S. agrees with and will support around the world, principles around democracy, pluralism, and the elements of independent institutions, which are critical for the functioning of governments. 2, we need to have a discussion about whether or not democracy can not only defend itself against autocracy and the rest, but can it deliver for its citizens? We have to have an honest conversation about whether or not democracies are delivering enough. And 3rd, I think we need to think differently about alliances here. I think we need to think about alliances, and the president needs to talk about this, with the private sector or different formulations of alliances where it matters to citizenry, around technology, around healthcare, around other issues that matter to citizens, and whether or not democracies are actually delivering at the end of the day.
All right. Well, we're going to end on what might be a positive note: America's ability to gather democracies and rally the cause of democracy around the world. Thank you, gentlemen. Juan, Dennis, thank you for joining us this week on Dakhel, Washington. Last month, I visited the United Arab Emirates after not having traveled to the country in several years. The architecture immediately grabs you: bold, audacious. But what struck me most was the political audacity of the UAE's fascinating national experiment. 10 non-Emiratis for every Emirati in a federation of small statelets that range from the traditional and conservative to the capital of global chic. There's a lot to praise, a lot to question, and like all countries, a lot to critique. But it's tough not to root for this Emirati experiment. And nothing exemplifies the bold audacity of the Emirates as Dubai Expo, the global gathering of 192 countries, plus assorted companies, industries, and themes, all trying to outdo each other to attract attention for their innovation, creativity, and curb appeal. I have never been to an expo before. As someone who's never had an interest in taking my kids to Disney World, I'm not much for these massive spectacles with even more massive lines. So I don't have a baseline for comparison. But you can't help but be impressed by the jaw-dropping spectacle of what the Emiratis have accomplished, both in terms of construction and showmanship, so much of it done during the COVID pandemic. After spending just one day at Dubai Expo, here's my totally unscientific assessment. Each of the 192 countries there had a basic decision to make as to how to present themselves to the world, and you could divide them into two. Those who chose to tell a universalist story of blurring differences and emphasizing commonalities to meet the transnational challenges of the future, and those who chose to tell a nationalist story of what unique contribution a country can make to addressing those challenges, drawing on the special history, culture, and national characteristics that are unlike those of any other country. What do I mean? Well, during my brief time at Expo, I visited the Saudi and Israeli pavilions, two very different countries with very different national stories and conceptions of themselves. But in my view, the pavilions were virtually interchangeable. They presented countries that decided to blur the unique characteristics, focus instead on the universal race car driving and beach vacations for the Saudis, Tel Aviv nightlife, and high-tech accomplishments for the Israelis. If you blink, you will miss any images of either of these countries as religious fixtures, although both are best known for their roles as leaders of Islam and Judaism, respectively. Perhaps there are good reasons for this emphasis on universalism from both Saudi Arabia and Israel, but I found it striking. I have to admit, I was pleasantly surprised at the American pavilion, which somehow found a way to weave together a uniquely American story of human and scientific curiosity and successive waves of immigration, while emphasizing the global, whether it be Thomas Jefferson's Quran, Elon Musk's Tesla, or gravel from Mars. Getting that pavilion up was not a simple story, but they did get the message right. Universalism or nationalism? Are there answers to our common problems found in transcending our differences or embracing them? If you can get to Expo, or at least check it out online, decide for yourself. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة في ما يتعلق بقيادة أمريكا للعالم في ظل إدارة بايدن، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.